You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. This morning, without evidence, President Trump called Los Angeles protesters professional agitators and insurrectionists. That's the latest after he deployed thousands of California National Guard troops in response to demonstrations in that city. Protests had broken out in response to stepped-up local immigration enforcement. California's Attorney General now says the state will sue the president over this. Here in Washington, we're looking at the status of how prepared Washington state is for the potential that the president could do the same here in the state, mobilize the National Guard. And we spoke with Washington's Attorney General Nick Brown earlier today about those questions. Just to note, his connection was a little spotty at times. He was on the phone in between meetings. So here's our conversation with Attorney General Nick Brown. So what are your initial impressions watching what is unfolding in Los Angeles as the president has sent California National Guard troops to quell protests against the wishes of the governor there?
Well, I think it's an incredibly dangerous moment, not only for California and Los Angeles, but for the rest of the country as well. And I say that because what we're seeing from the president, I think, is really making the situation worse by coming up with concocted reasons to call out the National Guard. It is contrary not only to what the president himself has said in prior incidences. You know, I was looking at some coverage in an interview with him from 2020 where he said that he wouldn't have the authority to do what he's doing now without the consent of the governor, which he clearly does not have in this case. Based on our read of what the president has done, it seems to be pretty clear that the president can only call in the National Guard with the agreement of the governor. And from what I've read, not only did he not have the agreement of the governor, but didn't actually even make any effort to consult with the governor of that state. And so to take such a reckless and extreme action that appears to be taken in this case is really, really troubling. And I think it portends for dangerous future actions by the president in other places. So we have been coordinating with the California AG's office very closely and monitoring the situation, but I think it's a real crisis point.
And so Trump has cited this Title 10 of the U.S. Code that he says allows him to call out members of the California National Guard into federal service. The title here says that if the U.S. is invaded, that this is a possibility, or that there is a rebellion or danger of rebellion, or the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. These are the situations in which this Title 10 can be invoked. You don't believe that this is the case here in Los Angeles?
Well, there's two separate things. One, just looking at the facts on the ground, and, I'm observing this like the rest of us in Washington from afar. So I can't obviously speak to all the facts on the ground, but it does not nearly seem to rise to that sort of circumstance. But even if that was the case, the statute also says that calling out the National Guard has to be done in consultation with the governor and approval of the governor. So even if we did have those serious facts on the ground, which from my observation we do not, to totally ignore the role of the state and impede on state sovereignty, it seems reckless and it seems political. And those things have to be done. We have to follow the law. We need to insist that the president and his administration abide by the rule of law. And that is not what we're seeing here, but it also should not be surprising because this is what President Trump has done his entirety of office, is ignore the Constitution, ignore statutory authority, ignore states' rights, and it is really, really dangerous.
Have you had any communication from the federal government about this deployment? I'm hearing you say that you communicate with the authorities in California about what's going on, but have you heard anything from the federal government?
No, in my role as Attorney General, we've been mostly concerned about coordinating with our counterparts in other states and here in California. So I have not been in contact with anybody in the federal government.
The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has threatened to mobilize active duty Marines in response to the protests in Los Angeles. And this would seem to be in, violation of laws against U.S. military engaging in law enforcement on U.S. soil, the Posse Comitatus Act. Do you take that as a serious possibility from the federal government at this point from what you've seen?
Well, we certainly have to take anything that the Secretary of Defense says seriously on the one hand, because these are the people that are in control of our various government entities. But to hear that from the Secretary of Defense is pretty scary because, as you note, you can't simply do that because you want to. And I think more broadly, what we're seeing from the president is, it really does meet the definition of fascism. And I don't say such a thing lightly. I think we have to be very careful about our language, but we're seeing authoritarianism, we're seeing dictatorial behavior, we're seeing that to suppress what the president believes is the opposition, and we're seeing a disregard for the rule of law, all of which are characteristics of a fascist government. And, when the Secretary of Defense is talking about activating the U.S. military to quell some disturbance in a city involving American citizens, we have to treat that very seriously, even though it's unprecedented and I think would be illegal.
The president has previously used Seattle as kind of a useful foil, especially talking about previous protests like the CHOP on Capitol Hill or, even Dan Bongino, the deputy director of the FBI, has mentioned on social media that he's looking into what happened at Cal Anderson Park a few weekends ago. Obviously, Seattle can produce protests, and this seems to be something that the president has put his sights on. Are you concerned about, what's next here for a blue state like Washington and a blue city like Seattle?
Well, I'm concerned for the country. I mean, we need to have a country that adheres to its fundamental principles of free speech, assembly, and First Amendment protections. And, it is really important that people who protest do so peacefully, that they not play into the president's rhetoric and the way that he views any of our cities across the country. I do want people to have their voices heard and do that in a way that creates welcoming environments and safe environments rather than dangerous environments. And Seattle's got a good reputation of protest and doing so in a way that gets people's points across, and we need to support that and follow the law in doing so. I'm not worried necessarily about Washingtonians' ability to do that, but I do think what we've seen in California creates this real tenuous environment, and is adding flames to the fire when the president talks about and takes the action of sending federal authorities in to respond to protest. And protests happen in every American city. They happen every season, and they happen for a whole variety of issues. And that has been the history of this country since its founding. And we need not to be dissuaded by illegal conduct from the president or anybody else in his administration.
I'm speaking with Attorney General Nick Brown, Attorney General of Washington State, about what's been going on. The President Trump deploying California National Guard troops to the streets of Los Angeles in response to protests over ICE enforcement raids. Attorney General, Governor Ferguson signed a law in April that restricts out-of-state military forces from entering Washington without the governor's permission. That took effect immediately. It doesn't seem like in this case that would prevent what's going on in California, right? I mean, we're talking about the state's own National Guard being deployed. Do you have a sense of how this legislation might apply?
Well, I think you're right that those are somewhat different circumstances, and that law was principally concerned with other states' National Guards being activated and brought into Washington. So we haven't seen that here, but of course, when the president violates the law, like if he appears to be doing in California, when he disregards the authorities of governors, I do think we have to be prepared for a myriad of different circumstances. And again, I think what the president is doing is really just adding fuel to the fire. And it seems from the comments of LAPD themselves that they felt that they had it largely under control. There were things that were dangerous happening down there, but the need for National Guard forces or certainly the U.S. military was not called upon. And that is why our Congress set up these procedures where the president has to coordinate with state authorities and state governors to make sure that the circumstances on the ground actually call for federal assistance and federal action. And when the president just ignores that, it just makes it a more dangerous situation. And, I'm very mindful of the fact that we're going to have more circumstances like this in California, in Washington. People are rightly scared about what we're seeing from the federal government. They're scared about the way that ICE has been kidnapping people off the streets and violating due process rights and ignoring court orders. and people want to protest because of that. And we need to make sure that we respect those rights to protest, that we demand that protesters are acting peacefully and safely. But I have not seen a circumstance yet that requires National Guard assistance, or certainly the assistance from the Marines. And if you're going to take those steps, we should all require that the president follow the law. And that is my job as the Attorney General, to make sure that that happens in Washington.
California AG Rob Bonta has announced that the state will be suing Trump over the deployment of the National Guard. Governor Gavin Newsom there has called the deployment illegal and immoral. It sounds like, Attorney General Brown, that you agree that if something like this were to happen in Washington, would you plan to also file a legal challenge?
Yeah, if the same facts presented themselves here in Washington, and the president ignored Governor Ferguson's authority and violated the statute and violated our rights, then we would absolutely litigate.
Attorney General Nick Brown, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Governor Bob Ferguson signed a statement from the Democratic Governors Association this weekend supporting Governor Newsom. I wanted to read part of that statement, which includes, quote, "It's important we respect the executive authority of our country's governors to manage their National Guards, and we stand with Governor Newsom, who has made it clear that violence is unacceptable and that local authorities should be able to do their jobs without the chaos of this federal interference and intimidation." Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.